Hi there, everybody, and welcome back to Insomnia. I'm your host, Adrian Ladelia, and, well, let's get right into it. Throughout most of ancient history, there has always existed an idea of dualism in the context of cosmology. Essentially, a fairly common belief was that there were always two fundamental forces at work within the universe, going all the way back to its very conception, or even antecedently. These two forces were said to be invariably working to counteract the other. For every instance of one side's vacillation, the other would follow suit with a counter-movement. Though distinct in their own particularity, the two have always shared a form of conscious or unconscious synergistic actuality. Ergo, it was believed that one simply could not exist without the other. Where there is light, so too shall there always be dark. It is a darkness that is said to exist within us all, one that creeps just below the surface of our awareness and sometimes may take on a life of its own. German folklore makes a specific reference to this, in the form of an entity with a name not just known to those involved with the Preternatural, but within popular media as well. They call it the Doppelgänger, an uncanny apparition which appears as a mirror image or double of a person. The name itself, meaning Doppelgänger, was coined in 1796 by German writer Johann Paul Friedrich Richter, and the distinction here between something like, say, a ghost or other phenomena is that the doppelganger appears while the individual is still alive, and as such, they are unanimously considered bad omens or harbingers of doom, for if you are to encounter your doppelganger, death would surely follow. But where did such a harrowing symbol emerge from? Like all myths and stories, we'll have to go way further back to try and discover its origins and shed some light on this dark occurrence. This brings us all the way back to 300 CE, where the migration of the Germanic people, or Teutonic people, had spread all throughout Europe in what has become known as the Migration Period, or Völkerwanderung, as it is referred to in German. Until about 800 CE, give or take, these tribes of Proto-European speaking peoples such as the Goths, Saxons, Vandals, Burgundians, etc. would descend from the north and occupy everywhere from Scandinavia to Italy and Greece, and this caused significant problems with the then existing Roman Empire. In fact, the Roman Empire's history explicitly refers to this period as the barbarian invasions. Regardless, the settling of the Germanic peoples would go on to produce many of the European ethnic groups that we know today, and in this case specifically, Germany and the Nordic countries. As such, they share common roots in their mythology, as it dates all the way back to these ancient times in particular. Fantastic beings such as elves, dwarves, fairies, elementals, and of course, the Dark Ones as well. In fact, in Norse mythology, there is a phantom image of a living person known as the VARDØGER, which is said to perform the immediate future actions of a certain individual and is oftentimes seen by everyone except that individual. Another similar entity which has developed over time is the Irish Fetch, which again is a phantom image of a living person, suggesting that soon said individual will meet their end. All of these stories would eventually spread throughout Europe and become a staple in Gothic literature known as the double. In fact, this concept of a double, or alter ego as it would become known, would eventually be extensively detailed and analyzed in 1914 by Austrian psychoanalyst Otto Rank in his very influential work, The Double. The doppelganger is oftentimes described as eerie, ghastly, and most of all, uncanny. The encounters can be for but a moment or what feels like an eternity. They can be seen by you, and sometimes they can be seen by others. According to folklore, they're said to never cast a shadow, hence why they oftentimes appear in the dark. Conversely, if they ever are to cast a shadow, it appears headless. Some stories say that much like the horrible Nosferatu, should they stand before a mirror, there would be no reflection. There's a certain level of fear involved when it comes to truly looking within yourself and seeing you for how you are. So let's take a look at a few stories which do exactly that. Our first story brings us back to the turn of the 19th century, involving German writer and poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe was traveling home on a country road with the weight of a broken heart, for he had just parted ways with a dear friend. The road was barren until he noticed an approaching rider who seemingly had appeared from out of nowhere. As the mysterious rider passed, he was amazed to see it was a mirror image of himself, wearing a distinct gray suit with golden buttons, the likes of which he did not possess. And in a moment it was over. Years later, Goethe would return to see his lover down that same road, and a moment of amazement dawned on him when he realized he was wearing that same gray coat with golden buttons. Our next story brings us back to 1861 with none other than Abraham Lincoln, who would serve as the 16th President of the United States. According to legend, Lincoln had returned home after his first presidential inauguration and collapsed from exhaustion. It was then that a mirror across the room had caught his eye, for the face staring back was a horrible mockery of his image with sunken eyes and pallor complexion. Startled, he stood up to inspect the mirror only to see the face still glaring back at him, and in the blink of an eye it was gone. Lincoln had supposedly relayed this story to several close friends and his wife, who feared it was an omen that he would not survive his presidency. This final story is a first-hand account told to me by a close friend of some years. There had been a lot of confusion in his household for about a week, and his mother kept complaining about his behavior, saying he had been rude and downright creepy sometimes by coming in and out of the house and ignoring her whilst he did it. He had no recollection of any of these events, and in every instance, he was either at school or simply away from home when they supposedly took place. One evening, he returns home to find the house empty, lights out and doors locked. His phone begins vibrating, and he can see that it's a call from his mother. She begins chastising him about his odd behavior once more, saying that he was creepily standing in the living room, just staring blankly at her as she left for an evening event she had planned. A feeling of sheer panic wells up inside him as he feels an ominous presence nearby. He asks his mother, "How long ago was it that you left?" She said it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. So what could these entities actually be? Well, many cultures, both ancient and contemporary, have all had their concept of a double, or spirit double, the alter ego as we discussed, and it was said to be able to manifest in this world should the circumstances allow. The ancient Egyptians believed in what they would call the Ka, which was essentially the spiritual double of every living person, which gives us life, is separated upon death, and continues to live on outside the body, hence their reverence and treatment of the deceased. Interestingly enough, much of folklore also describes one's shadow as a representation of the soul. It was thought to be an extension of one's self, and should it be hurt, so too would the owner. Mirrors also are important, as many believe that the reflection of yourself before you is in fact its own entity or consciousness entirely, which honestly raises a number of philosophical questions in and of itself. Finally, some go so far as to say that portraits, such as paintings and pictures, are enough to be able to be considered co-equivalents of the soul. This is why many cultures, even today, are wary of having their pictures taken, as they believe their soul could be trapped within the image. The idea of paintings is also a key theme in the 1890 novel The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. While this all helps to contextualize where some of the themes of the doppelganger stories may come from, it doesn't entirely help to explain what they actually are. For example, we assume a ghost is just the remnant energy of a dead individual, and so on and so forth. So what does that make a mirror image of yourself with a sinister aura? Well, we'll have to dig a bit deeper here and try and understand a bit more about the ancient views of the soul, according to some of the oldest sources. In most Western interpretations and some schools of thought, the concept of self is mostly divided into three parts: the body, mind, and soul. All of these form together to create different aspects of what you would call you. But according to ancient sources, and this is a gross oversimplification of a very nuanced and overlapping belief system, the Norse soul was said to be divided into roughly 4 to 5 parts, generally speaking. There was first the HAMR, which roughly means shape or skin, your spiritual double, which lays within your physical body but is capable of changing shape and leaving under the right circumstances. This spirit is supposedly also how the world itself perceives you. Next, there was the HUGR, or HUG, which means thoughts or minds. This would be considered your inner self, or the soul of the mind, your overall consciousness, if you will. Then there was the VARDÖGER, or the follower. This was described as a feminine or female energy that manifests as a spirit attendant and follows one from birth to death. Many consider this spirit to be a guardian of sorts for your entire familial lineage, as a lot of these cultures practiced ancestral worship, so it would make a little bit of sense. Oftentimes, parallels are drawn between this spirit and a familiar of witchcraft lore. The key difference here, though, is that if your VARDÖGER dies, apparently so do you. So, could the doppelganger be some type of spiritual remnant from this forgotten age? Some lost aspect of oneself? Maybe, but some would say there can always be a more logical explanation. While it's fascinating to think that there are spirits and mysteries abound in this world, many are quick to suggest that all of these can be explained by some rational means. In this case, many are quick to suggest that there may indeed be more at play than one suspects, but rather in their mind than in the outside world. In 2006, a study in Switzerland to aid an epileptic patient discovered that by stimulating the left temporoparietal junction of the brain with electrodes, they created a frightening and mysterious effect on the individual. The patient claimed there was now someone else in the room with them, standing right behind them, mirroring their every move like a shadow. The same way magnetic fields have a seemingly correlated effect with ghosts, could the same be said for doppelgangers? There are, of course, several alternative explanations which also come up, such as perhaps your encounter was a dream. Perhaps your encounter was merely an effect of sleep paralysis, as many people do claim to see their doppelganger whilst unable to move in bed. Sometimes these encounters can be onset by things such as substance abuse and or lack of sleep in general. Some people go so far as to say maybe you were just mistaken, as many average faces display some common features, and when compared side by side, people just tend to subconsciously find similarities. But many people say it's just a numbers game. Seeing as there are over 7 billion people on the planet, well, there has to be someone who looks just like you. Well, there was one attempt to try to quantify just that, the chances of you having a person out there who looks just like you somewhere in the world. In a 2015 study by Ateague and Lucas of the University of Adelaide, they compared specific facial measurements of individuals in photographs. The more measurements that were used, the less likely you would find someone who matched. But when using less, it was easy to find some general similarities. Basically, the study concluded that finding someone else with just 8 matching facial measurements as yourself was about 1 in 1 trillion. So would it still stand to reason that you would have a twin out there, just by sheer numbers alone? Well, it seems unlikely, but with most of these stories, sometimes logic, and what we perceive as reality, seem to not always apply. So ultimately we are left with a lot of questions we may never have the answers to. Could it be that some extension of your soul is capable of leaving the body and forming its own physical being? If so, what significance does it hold, and what is it trying to say? Why would encountering oneself be considered an omen of misfortune? Perhaps at some point or another, this concept held some powerful meaning, long since forgotten. If the doppelganger is considered evil, then what does that say about it existing within you? All we know for sure is that in some ancient beliefs, this entity held a special place amongst those who would have sought immortality. Proof that the soul itself can be copied and live on after your own demise, but now is only a symbol of terror, and most often referred to as the uncanny. I'll leave you with a quote by Sigmund Freud in reference to the works of Rank on the subject. The uncanny is that form of terror that leads back to something long known to us, once very familiar, but has become terrifying because it corresponds to something repressed that has returned. The double has become an image of terror, just as, after the collapse of their religion, the gods turned into demons. I'm your host, Adrian Ladelia, and this is Insomnia.